The desert air hung heavy with heat as Sergeant Elias Rang crouched behind the shattered remains of a burned transport truck, and he could feel his heartbeat hammering in his ears as enemy fire sliced the air around him like invisible blades, and he knew the line would not hold much longer, and the others around him sensed it too as morale cracked like the very ground beneath them, and yet even with the dust storms rising there was still no sign of evacuation, and Elias whispered to himself that he would send one last call for help even if no one could answer as shapes in the distance began to move closer, leaving him unsure if they were allies or the final wave that would end everything, and so he steadied his trembling hands preparing to transmit the final signal as the wind carried the sound of distant engines whose origin he did not yet dare to guess. The radio crackled in his grip as he patched together the last bit of power from its dying battery, and he swallowed tightly, knowing the command network had gone dark after the ambush, and every attempt at contact earlier had met only with static that screamed louder than any threat, and he muttered coordinates into the handset, hoping the call cleared the interference. Even though he knew the likelihood of any friendly aircraft flying this deep in contested territory was nearly impossible, and each second he waited felt heavier than the one before as the sun dipped behind a ridge, casting a long shadow over the field that seemed to swallow what little hope he still held, and yet he forced his voice steady while sending the message, unaware of the faint silhouette forming in the far distance behind the dust cloud that flickered like a ghost waiting to choose its moment around him. The remaining squad members huddled low as the enemy pressed forward with renewed force, and Elias felt the vibration of artillery thudding in the dirt like pounding fists demanding entry into their shrinking circle, and he knew they could not last long even with their most determined resistance, and he told them he had sent the final broadcast, though he dared not promise anything, and their eyes held silent questions, none of them voiced, because the truth was too heavy to speak into the choking air. And still in that moment he sensed something strange, a shifting of the wind, a faint mechanical groan on the edge of hearing, as if something enormous and wounded was climbing through the heavens in search of them, and he wondered if it was simply imagination born of desperation, or if the desert was truly whispering that something was coming their way. Elias lifted his head above the ruined metal for just a moment, trying to scan the sky for any sign of movement, but the glare of the sinking sun blinded him until tears welled and spilled down his cheeks, and he almost cursed aloud as a bullet snapped past his ear, reminding him the enemy was growing impatient and their fire was tightening into a focused kill pattern, and he ducked again, breathing through clenched teeth, wondering if maybe this was the final hour of their fight, because everything around them felt carved by doom and inevitability, although deep in his chest he refused to let go completely of the faint pressure of hope as that distant mechanical groan returned, now louder and more insistent, like a wild heartbeat echoing across the barren land, urging him not to surrender yet. He crawled across cracked earth toward a small higher mound, trying to get a clearer view of the northern sky, and every movement sent waves of pain along his arms and legs from the heat and exertion, and the ground sizzled beneath his palms as enemy rounds struck nearby, kicking dirt across his face, and he tried again to raise command on the radio with nothing but a shrill scream of static returning to him like a cruel laugh, and he pressed his head against the ground for just a moment, exhausted and wondering whether the message even traveled far enough to be heard by a single friendly unit, and yet still that sky drone of machinery persisted, growing clearer with every second, as though climbing over the far ridge of a world that had forgotten them, and he dared to think that maybe something was answering, though he did not yet allow himself to turn that thought into belief. Behind him, the soldiers in his squad began muttering nervously as the enemy approached in spreading formations, moving with grim certainty, as though confident the battlefield was already theirs, and Elias could not blame them for the fear in their voices, because every tactical readout told him the same truth: their perimeter was collapsing, their ammunition dwindling, and the only cover left would soon be useless under a sustained push. And yet, even in that impending suffocation, he still felt that strange vibration in the ground, a low tremor that did not match artillery patterns, and he frowned as dust shifted around his boots. like shaken by distant thunder, although the sky remained absent of storms, and he realized the sound was growing stronger and fuller, building with a depth that no enemy craft ever carried, and a shiver ran through him as he raised his gaze once more toward the horizon to see if the impossible was truly forming there. The western dunes shimmered as if melting under the weight of heat, but through the wavering air Elias caught a momentary flash of metal gleaming through smoke, and he blinked, unsure whether his mind was playing tricks upon him. But the flash came again, followed by a trailing haze that looked like a smear of vapor or perhaps leaking fluid, and he felt his heart jolt painfully in his chest because it looked like the silhouette of a craft, yet one flying far lower than anything civilian or commercial, and he squinted, pressing his fingers against his brow to shield his eyes from the glare as the shape dipped again, revealing the unmistakable thick outline of wings, though one appeared jagged as if torn apart, and he whispered breathlessly that it could not possibly be flying like that at such altitude and angle, and yet it continued to push forward, stubbornly carving its path across the burning sky. He scrambled to his feet despite the danger, drawing the attention of enemies who fired angrily in his direction, and he ducked again, but not before he saw the shape emerge, fully breaking through the drifting clouds that had masked its approach, and he felt a surge of heat in his chest because it was unmistakably an A-10, though limping and bleeding fuel in a long ribbon behind it, and he could hardly speak as he watched it wobble through turbulence, refusing to fall despite the mangled frame that would have destroyed any other aircraft, and the realization that someone was still flying it, someone fighting to reach them, filled him with a shock so fierce he forgot the danger for a moment and simply stared as the craft approached lower and lower, with a fury in its engine that promised something none of them dared hope for. Yet the squad saw it too now, and whispers rushed through them like a current as recognition dawned and disbelief warred with relief, because no one had expected any air support, especially not one clearly damaged past the point of reason, yet still clawing toward the battle. And Elias felt the tremor beneath his boots strengthen as the thunder of the craft deepened, shaking the earth with raw, stubborn life as the fuel streaming from its belly caught the light, turning into a shining silver trail like a comet streaking across the desert sky, and he thought whoever was piloting that beast was either mad or heroic, or perhaps a mixture of both, and he felt electricity race through him at the thought that salvation might be arriving in the most impossible shape imaginable. And yet, just as he tried to rise and signal the craft, something in the distance shifted abruptly as the enemy forces halted in place, raising their weapons toward the incoming aircraft, aware now of its presence and its trajectory. And Elias swallowed dryly because the fight was far from over, and a damaged A-10 was still a vulnerable target, and even if it reached them, it might not survive the concentrated response that was surely seconds away. And he felt cold fear grip him once more as the dust swirled around the incoming craft, forming a halo of smoke that hid its cockpit from view, leaving him to wonder whether the pilot inside realized just how dire the situation was becoming, and whether they would push through regardless, as the enemy prepared a barrage that could change everything again in a single breath. The A-10 roared lower, still engines straining, frame trembling, smoke and fuel streaming behind it like the tail of a wounded animal, yet still refusing to yield. And Elias braced himself because he knew the next few seconds would determine whether hope would rise or collapse entirely beneath the weight of fire and metal and destiny. And as he tightened his grip on his rifle, he heard the first enemy launcher ignite with a hollow whooshing hiss as the missile streaked upward toward the incoming craft, leaving him breathless and unable to look away as the sky lit with a burning arc aimed directly at the fragile heart of their last chance. And as the missile drew closer, the desert seemed to stop breathing, leaving Elias standing amid a world paused on the edge of fate, waiting to see whether the impossible arrival would become their salvation or vanish in fire before their eyes, with the answer locked in the next heartbeat to come, you said. The second the distant roar faded into the smoke-choked horizon, Grant tried to steady his hands, though the shaking kept creeping back through his muscles like a cold wind, and he knew the sound he heard could not have been real. Yet something inside Him insisted that he had not imagined it, which left him questioning whether hope was returning or if his mind had finally begun to fracture under the crushing pressure of isolation and the approaching enemy as he strained to hear anything that would tell him he was not alone out there in the dead air that surrounded his last defensive position, and he felt the ground begin to tremble with a rhythm he recognized even as he feared it might belong to something far worse, leaving him hanging. On the edge of impossible certain, Tive crawled out from the collapsed comms shelter, dragging himself over debris and shattered metal, only to peer across the fractured valley where shadows twisted like living things in the haze, and he saw nothing. At first, no shape, no silhouette, no sign that the sky had returned its answer to his dying signal, but then a faint shimmer flickered high above as though the sun had struck a dislodged fragment of steel tumbling through the air, and he swore that glint moved with intention, not with the randomness of falling wreckage, which made him rise despite the pain digging into his ribs, because if that glint belonged to what he hoped, then help had arrived in the most impossible moment, leaving him desperate to see it again. The wind shifted, dragging with it the thick odor of burnt fuel and torn metal, and Grant moved closer to the ridge, ignoring the distant crack of rifles as enemy scouts closed in on his position, for he knew he had only moments before they locked onto him fully, yet he could not force himself back into cover, not when the sky whispered that something was descending, something battered and wounded perhaps, but alive and refusing to surrender, and he tilted his head, scanning each break in the drifting smoke until he saw it a shape almost too broken to resemble what it once was, and his breath caught because what he saw made no sense, and yet it was undeniable, leaving him rooted in stunned disbelief. A-10 emerged through the lowest curtain of smoke, its profile warped and torn, its left wing shedding fuel in a shimmering trail that caught the faint sunlight like droplets of fire, and Grant felt something surge inside him, something that pushed back against the despair that had been crushing him for hours, because that aircraft should not have been able to fly, not with damage like that, not with the entire battlefield stacked against it, and yet there it was, pushing through the air in a defiant crawl as if held aloft by sheer will, and he realized then that whoever was piloting that machine had refused to die even after the sky itself tried to swallow them, leaving him staring at the impossible craft hanging just above the treetops. Engines sputtered a broken, uneven thunder that echoed down the valley and sent the enemy patrol scattering for cover as the A-10 dipped low, almost scraping the rocky outcroppings, while Grant watched, sensing that the pilot was fighting desperately to maintain altitude as each second passed, which made every movement of the aircraft feel like a battle of its own, and he could picture the pilot inside, sweating, bleeding, maybe barely conscious, yet gripping the controls with stubborn force, driving that beast forward through a storm that should have torn it apart. And as the aircraft rolled slightly, he caught a glimpse of scorched markings that confirmed it was the same one he had signaled earlier, leaving him breathless with the realization of who must be inside death. Memory of the pilot's voice crackled faintly in his mind from the brief comms exchange before the sky had gone dead, the voice of the single mother who had fought her way through impossible odds earlier in the day to cover the retreating Marines, the woman whose call sign had carried a mix of grit and quiet resilience, and now, as he saw her aircraft limping back through the smoke, he felt something like guilt and admiration twist together inside him, because she had returned when no one expected her to, and she had done so carrying a machine that looked one burst away from collapsing entirely, leaving him wondering how she managed to stay airborne at Ulth. Enemy forces rallied quickly, realizing that the limping craft posed an opportunity to strike, and Grant saw them spreading out, forming lines of fire on the slopes, preparing to unleash everything at the vulnerable A-10 as it passed overhead, and he knew he could not let that happen, even though he had almost no ammunition left and no reinforcements coming, and yet the sight of that torn aircraft struggling to protect them despite its wounds stirred something deep inside him, compelling him to move, even if moving meant exposing himself to almost certain death, and he lifted his rifle, aiming down the ridge, determined to buy her even a few seconds more, leaving him bracing for the inevitable clashes. He fired his last rounds into the advancing enemy. He heard the pitch of the A-10 change its engines straining with a new urgency, and he realized the pilot must have seen the same threat he did because the aircraft lurched upward, gathering the last of its strength and banking sharply to the side in a motion that defied the damage scarring its frame, and as it rolled, Grant saw explosions spark along its hull where rounds had pierced the thin remaining armor, yet the aircraft kept turning, kept fighting, kept refusing to fall, leaving him swallowing hard as he watched the wounded machine execute maneuvers it had no right to perform. The aircraft lined up with the enemy positions, and Grant understood what was coming, an attack that should have been impossible with the systems likely failing and the weapons probably barely operational. Yet the A-10 dove anyway, descending like a wounded predator and willing to let its prey advance, and he felt the ground tremble as the engines roared louder than they had since its reappearance, a sound that cut through the smoke and shook loose the dust clinging to the shattered cliffs, and then the nose of the A-10 dipped as if offering the final choice to the pilot, who seemed determined to fight until her machine collapsed around her, leaving Grant staring in awestruck fear. A burst of fire erupted from beneath the aircraft, a sputtering, uneven light that signaled the weapons were still functional, although barely, and the rounds tore into the hillside, scattering enemy fighters in a wave of chaos as Grant watched the impossible unfold before his eyes, seeing the aircraft push through the spray of bullets and shrapnel cast up by the returning fire, and despite the holes punched through its body, despite the smoke curling from its engines, despite the fuel streaming behind it like a bright falling ribbon, the A-10 held steady, delivering one last furious strike, leaving Grant gripping the ground in shocked disbelief. Aircraft pulled up at the last second, engines screaming as though on their final breath, and Grant could tell it had expended everything in that desperate attack because it wobbled heavily, dipping dangerously close to the tree line where any miscalculation would send it tearing into the ground, and he took a step forward as if he could somehow guide it upward, willing it to rise even as the engines coughed in protest and the fuel leak intensified, pouring out in thick shimmering streams that trailed behind the wobbling craft, leaving him torn between hope and dread as he waited to see whether it would recover or fall. The A-10 wavered in the air like a wounded animal clinging to the last fibers of strength it possessed, and Grant felt a crushing fear that this final climb was too much for the battered machine, yet he refused to look away as the aircraft steadied, for a moment catching a thin fragile pocket of lift before dipping again toward the forest canopy, and each twitch of the wings felt like a plea, a cry for the sky to hold it up for just one moment longer, because somewhere inside that torn fuselage the pilot was still fighting with everything she had, leaving Grant bracing himself for whatever came next. As the engines sputtered, the craft drifted dangerously close to the ridge slope, scraping the tops of the battered pines and sending bursts of needles into the smoky air, and Grant knew that if the A-10 descended only a few more feet, it would be lost, completely swallowed by the trees and shattered on the rocks below. But the aircraft tilted upward slightly as though the pilot had found One last reserve of will deep within her exhaustion, and the nose lifted just enough to break free of the treetop line, yet the wobble in its frame suggested that even this small victory came at a terrible cost, leaving Grant waiting to see if the aircraft could hold together for even a few more seconds. The roar of the engines deepened suddenly, and Grant felt the vibrations in his chest as the A-10 pushed forward, fighting through the drag of its leaking fuel and shredded plating as though it had decided it would not fall until it had delivered its pilot to safety or death on her own terms, and Grant stared in awe because the machine seemed to move with a strange, stubborn purpose, defying gravity, defying probability, defying the damage etched across its battered shell as it advanced toward the open valley ahead, and the way the pilot held her course so steadily made it clear she had not returned just to survive, she had returned to protect, leaving him struggling to comprehend her resolve. As the enemy forces recovered from the strafing run, they began repositioning along the valley floor, preparing to fire on the retreating aircraft, and Grant could hear their shouts echoing off the stone walls like distant thunder as they clustered near their heavy weapon emplacements, hoping to bring down the A-10 before it escaped their reach, and Grant felt an overwhelming dread because he could see the smoke trailing from the wings thickening with each second, signaling that the aircraft had almost no life left in it, and yet it continued forward, ignorant of the danger building behind it, leaving him torn between screaming for the pilot to climb and praying she could make just one more pass. The first salvo from the enemy struck the air behind the A-10, sending a shockwave through the valley that rattled Grant's bones, and he flinched as fragments of broken earth rained down around him, scattering across the ruined ground, while the aircraft jolted slightly, as though brushed by the very edge of the blast, but it held its course, and Grant realized the pilot was attempting something desperate, something only a person with nothing left to give would attempt, because rather than trying to flee, she was turning the aircraft slowly, inch by inch, back toward the enemy lines, leaving him frozen as he wondered if she intended to fight one final time. As A-10 curved in a wide broken arc, its damaged wing dragging slightly but refusing to collapse, and as the aircraft banked, Grant saw the cockpit shift into view through a thinning veil of smoke, and he imagined the pilot inside gripping the controls with trembling hands, every motion sending pain stabbing through her arms, yet she kept the aircraft steady, guiding it into a descent that brought it closer and closer to the ground below, and Grant's heart raced because the angle was too severe, too reckless, too final, and yet it felt deliberate, as though she had chosen exactly how this moment would unfold, leaving him breathless with anticipation. The enemy forces realized too late what was happening as the low-flying aircraft leveled out barely above the earth, its engines now a choked howl that rattled the loose stones along the valley floor, and the soldiers scattered in panic, diving behind their barricades, while the A-10 surged forward, gathering the tiny fragments of speed it still possessed, pushing itself into a straight line that cut directly across the enemy's fortified positions, and Grant understood that the pilot was aiming to break their formation one last time with whatever remained of her weapons or her sheer presence, leaving him clinging to the rocks as he watched the impossible unfold. The remaining cannons on the aircraft sparked erratically, firing in uneven bursts as though coughing out the last remnants of ammunition left in the ruptured feed lines, and each burst carved a path through the enemy fighters, sending explosions of dirt and debris into the air, while the scattered troops scrambled in confusion, trying to understand how the damaged aircraft still possessed the strength to attack, and the sight of them faltering gave Grant a spark of hope spreading through his chest like the first warm breath after hours of cold despair, leaving him praying the pilot could hold the line for just a few seconds longer. The A-10 streaked across the battlefield low enough that its wingtip sliced through a rising plume of dust, and Grant saw the flames licking along the seam of the left engine flare brighter as fuel cascaded into the air like dark shimmering rain, and for a moment it looked as though the entire craft would erupt into a rolling explosion, yet it kept moving, pressing forward with unstoppable determination, dragging its shredded frame through a gauntlet of bullets that tore fresh holes into its armor, and Grant felt the weight of the pilot's sacrifice settle over him heavy and unrelenting, leaving him wondering how Anyone could fight so hard with so little left. The aircraft struck the far ridge in a violent skid, its landing gear gone, its engines collapsing beneath the force of the impact as it scraped through the rocky slopes, sending sparks showering into the air, and Grant cried out instinctively as he watched the craft grind to a halt against a natural embankment, the torn fuselage folding inward as the smoke billowed upward in thick dark waves, and the battlefield fell eerily silent for a moment, as though the world itself paused to witness the aftermath, and Grant felt his chest tighten with fear because the aircraft was still intact enough that the pilot could be alive inside, leaving him frozen between hope and terror. Grant sprinted down the slope, ignoring the pain in his legs as he navigated the shattered terrain, dodging craters and fallen debris with a single desperate goal forming in his mind, and he pushed past the choking smoke that swirled around the wreckage, stumbling toward the cockpit where dim flickers of light still glowed through the warped metal, as though the machine refused to surrender even after its final charge. And when he reached the front of the aircraft, he could see movement inside, slight and weak, but unmistakably human, leaving him surging forward with renewed urgency. Tore at the bent metal frame, using every ounce of strength he had left as the heat threatened to sear his skin and the fumes stung his lungs until he could barely breathe, and yet he refused to stop because he could hear the faint rasp of breathing from within the cockpit, a fragile, uneven whisper of life that pushed him onward. And Grant wedged his arm into the narrow gap, finally prying open enough space to glimpse the pilot slumped over the controls, her face streaked with soot, her eyes barely open yet still flickering with awareness, leaving him momentarily stunned by her unbreakable will. She looked at him with a tired, almost disbelieving expression, as though surprised to find herself still alive, and Grant reached in, grasping her arm gently to pull her out, but she resisted for a moment, shaking her head weakly, and he realized she was searching the cockpit for something she refused to leave behind. And as her hand brushed against a small worn photograph taped near the console, he understood that the fight she had carried through the sky had been driven by more than duty, more than survival, and more than the battlefield itself, leaving him silently witnessing the depth of her resolve. Grant lifted her from the cockpit, cradling her weight as carefully as he could while the fires crackled behind them, growing hotter with each second, and she leaned against him, barely able to stand, yet somehow remaining conscious long enough to glance back at the wreckage of her aircraft as though offering it one final silent farewell. And Grant felt an ache in his chest as he carried her farther from the crash, knowing the enemy forces were still nearby, regrouping and preparing to advance again, leaving him painfully aware that their struggle was not yet finished. As he reached the shelter of a fallen ridge, he set her down gently, listening as she struggled to catch her breath, trying to speak, though the words came out faint and strained, and he could see the determination still woven into her expression, that same fierce, unyielding fire that had kept the A-10 in the air long after it should have fallen. And she pointed weakly toward the distant valley where the remnants of his unit had fled earlier in the day, silently urging him to continue the fight, to keep moving, because there was still a chance, however small, that they could survive, leaving him on the edge of a decision that could shape the fate of them all. The distant rumble of engines echoed again through the valley, this time not from her aircraft, but from something larger approaching from beyond the smoke, and Grant knew that reinforcements could not possibly arrive so quickly, and fear twisted in his stomach as he strained to distinguish the sound, growing louder with each passing heartbeat. And he felt the pilot's hand grip his arm weakly, urging him to remain alert.